So can we assume that you or persons under your direction at the Department of Justice have prepared that list of groups or entities who are designated as domestic terrorist organizations? And I just remind you, that's a yes or no question. Did you prepare the list?
I'm not going to answer it yes or no, but what I will say is I know Antifa.
Representative Mary Gay Scanlon confronted Attorney General Pam Bondi about whether the Justice Department is keeping a list of Americans tied to domestic terrorism. The moment turned tense when Bondi acknowledged that such a list exists, but refused to promise Congress it would ever see it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bondi, I'm here. On September 25th, President Trump signed a memorandum known as NSPM 7, purporting to address domestic terrorism. But Americans across the political spectrum were immediately alarmed by the memo's blurring of the line between unlawful conduct and constitutionally protected speech and activity, as well as its call to investigate, prosecute, and dismantle groups that the president and Stephen Miller described without evidence as, quote, an organized campaign of radical left terrorism. Now, counterterrorism experts were further alarmed by the administration's singular focus on left-wing extremism, combined with the sudden deletion from the DOJ website of decades of research and law enforcement analysis, which had concluded that right-wing extremism poses the greatest terrorism threat to Americans. The president's memo broadly and vaguely links violent conduct to ideologies, and it targeted specifically anti-American, anti-Christian, and anti-capitalist beliefs, as well as, quote, hostility to so-called traditional American views on family, religion, and morality, end quote. President Trump has repeatedly and openly, however falsely, tried to brand his political opponents with these sentiments listed in his memo. But as you know, as a lawyer, holding beliefs that the White House disagrees with is not a crime. And the statute defining domestic terrorism requires criminal acts, not just thoughts and ideas. That's why legal experts, nonprofit leaders, religious freedom, and civil rights advocates immediately raised the alarm that the new presidential directive was a politically motivated attack on civil society designed to silence those who disagree with the administration. So, Ms. Bondi, Section 3 of that memo directed you, as Attorney General, to submit to the President and Stephen Miller a list of groups or entities whose members are engaged in acts that meet the definition of domestic terrorism. And then on December 4th, you directed the FBI to work with a variety of law enforcement entities to compile a list of groups and entities engaged in such acts by January 3rd, 2026, and to update that report every 30 days thereafter. So can we assume that you or persons under your direction at the Department of Justice have prepared that list of groups or entities who are designated as domestic terrorist organizations? And I just remind you, that's a yes or no question. Did you prepare the list?
I'm not going to answer it yes or no, but what I will say is I know Antifa is part of that. I will talk to you about that.
I'm reclaiming my time. I asked you whether you
an
prepared
Antifa member
a list.
was arrested in Minneapolis
I'm
federal
reclaiming
court for
my
cyber
time.
stalking.
Did you
they
have
ask a question
list?
and don't want an answer.
The answer is yes or no.
Time belongs to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Gentlelady can proceed.
Okay. So will you commit to providing this committee with any list of organizations that you have recommended be designated as domestic terrorist organizations?
We will comply with the law in all matters.
Will you commit to provide this committee with your list of entities that you recommend be designated as domestic terrorist organizations?
I'm not going to commit to anything to you because you won't let me answer questions.
Okay, well then we do understand that your current position is that you have a secret list of people or groups that you are accusing of domestic terrorism, but you won't share it with Congress. And I'd remind you that when the US government designates an entity as a foreign terrorist organization, it must report that to Congress and to the entity, because the government can make a mistake and the entity has the opportunity to contest it. So your position seems to be that if you falsely designate an American or an American organization as a terrorist group, There's nothing they can do about it. I think we get it. You don't want to answer the
No,
questions.
you don't get
that
anything
this
regarding
committee-
public safety.
Thank you.
Nothing.
Thank you for the insult. It's clear you didn't come to Congress prepared to answer questions that the American people have every right to have answered. But if you were prepared to answer truthfully, here's what we expect the facts to show. The administration is keeping lists of Americans who the White House says are engaged in domestic terrorism. Those lists could include Americans who have not committed any acts of terrorism, but simply disagree with this administration, people like Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And your list may include clergy, elected officials, and members of indivisible groups across the country. And those lists likely don't include Proud Boys or Oath Keepers who were actually convicted. Americans have never tolerated political demagogues who use the government to punish people on an enemies list. It brought down McCarthy, it brought down Nixon, and it will bring down this administration as well.
And you're right.
I yield back.
That's why we're so glad they rescinded the
That's right.
memorandum targeting parents. For goodness sake, as the gentleman from California just pointed out in his 5 minutes.
The exchange centered on a presidential directive known as NSPM 7, issued by Donald Trump, which ordered federal agencies to intensify investigations into what the administration described as radical left extremism. Scanlon argued that the directive blurred the line between violent activity and constitutionally protected beliefs, warning that the government could end up targeting ideology instead of criminal conduct. Under U.S. law, domestic terrorism requires violent acts intended to intimidate or coerce civilians or government policy, not simply political views. That legal distinction is why civil liberties groups worry about vague definitions in national security policies. During the hearing, Bondi confirmed that the Justice Department had compiled information on organizations connected to violent acts and mentioned Antifa while attempting to elaborate. But when Scanlon asked whether the full list would be shared with Congress, Bondi declined to make that commitment, arguing she would only comply with legal requirements. Scanlon then warned that secret designations could damage reputations and civil rights if individuals or groups are labeled without evidence or due process. Historically, the United States has faced similar controversies during periods such as the McCarthy era, when accusations of subversion led to blacklists and investigations that later drew heavy criticism. Supporters of aggressive counterterrorism argue that the government must track emerging threats quickly, while critics say secrecy risks political misuse. The deeper issue raised in this hearing is not just about one memo or one list. It is about how a democracy balances security with freedom of speech and association. If you want clear breakdowns that help you understand what really happens inside congressional hearings and why these debates shape the rights Americans live with every day, follow and stay informed.